Hello, here I am, back again for another review. This time we should be looking at a show that's a great deal harder to review than what I've done over the last few weeks, but I will try my best to do it justice. That show is of course Revolutionary Girl Utena, or Shoujo Kakume Utena, and is a 39 episode shoujo fantasy based on the manga series of the same name by Chiho Saito. It first aired in 1997, was one of the first series to be produced by that ever popular studio JC Staff, was written by Yoji Enikido and directed by Kunihiko Ikuhara. Now the reason I say it's a hard one to review, and honestly quite a hard work to describe in general, is that a lot of what forms its substance and identity is below the surface. It's a work that uses varied themes and ideas in conjunction with the story it tells to bring you something that can only really be done in this medium, in anime. It feels truly fictional and out of this world in a way only fairy tales are really able, and I think it's actually about time to tell you what it's about. When Utena Tenjo was a young girl, her parents died and she was left all alone, much in the way many anime characters are these days. She is saved from her despair by a passing prince who wipes away her tears and gives her a rose-crested ring. This leaves so much of impression on her that she strives to herself become a prince, which leads to her adopting a more masculine gender role later in life. The core of the story takes place in a rather delightful place called Otori Academy. Utena is a highly admired student who wears a male uniform, though it looks absolutely nothing like the uniform the other chaps wear, and would probably look a bit too fabulous if a bloke wore it. But anyway, that's beside the point. One day she gets in a scuffle with a member of the Academy's oh-so-extraordinary student council over a love letter incident with her friend. She challenges the council's vice president Saionji to a duel and finds out that the ring she was given by the prince gives her the right to be a duelist and challenge the dueling champion for the hand of the Rose Bride. It conveniently just so happens that Saionji, the man she's challenged to a duel for completely different reasons, is the dueling champion, and thus her duel to take vengeance for her friend becomes a duel for the Rose Bride. So who or what is the Rose Bride, and why is being her fiancé such a still a thing? The Rose Bride is a rather intriguing Sheila by the name of Anthe Himemiya, and grants the dueling champion with the power of Dios, the power to revolutionize the world. So, much to his dismay, Utena beats Saionji in the duel and of course becomes the dueling champion. She has no real wish to use the power of Dios and is instead driven to keep the Rose Bride to herself for the sole reason that she doesn't want others abusing Anthe, who she's quick to hold very close as a dear friend. From here on out, the bare bones of the story involve the rest of the student council and beyond challenging Utena to duels for many, many different reasons. This later unfolds into uncovering the mysteries and secrets behind Otori Academy whilst Utena remains steadfast in her lifetime goal of once again meeting the prince from her past. Sounds simple enough, but as I said leading into this, it is what lies beyond that makes this show what it is and what makes it so fantastic. From what sounds like it could end up being a fight of the week inducing plot that simply gives the story an excuse to have as many duels go down as possible, there is essentially none of the superficial and one-dimensional feeling you often get from shows like that. Each duel has genuine meaning and motive behind each participant and allowed the series to delve into a seemingly endless pool of thought-provoking themes. Whether it be a commonplace motivation like love or vengeance, or something a bit more considerable like existentialism, each time a duel takes place you feel as though something meaningful has happened. The characters involved grow and the story progresses, even if sometimes not by much, it's always relevant. This is all referring to the lead up and repercussions of the duels though, as the actual combat itself started to feel fairly repetitive after a while, especially when every time Utena ascends to the duel area, you're given a full 2-minute sequence reminiscent of a magical girl transformation of her journey skyward. Sure, you may say I'm being fussy about this, but 2 minutes is fairly considerable when you see an identical sequence every other episode. This sequence does change slightly with each of the story's 3 arcs, sure, but it still felt like the Team Rocket theme to me. Mainly because when you have magical girl transformations, they'll usually end up getting abridged after you've seen them a few times. But you see this full sequence over 20 times before the series through, and that's a decent 45 minutes of content. It's way less of an issue than the 100 words I just spouted about it though, as I think I was in the middle of making a point about the duels themselves. Yeah, so each duel employed some fairly nice swordplay, sure, but so many of them had an identical fight structure and would lead you to know exactly how and when each fight would end and who would come out on top. Simply made them feel a bit less in-depth than the ideas surrounding the fight is all. Moving on though, and to bring up something I love this show for, is that it is something I find so many shows flat out fail miserably to achieve. It knew the limits of silly. That sounds a bit weird, but the meaning behind that is this show employs a fair amount of comedy and does so in such an ideal way. The comedy is complete madcap lunacy. I mean, it's got an episode about an exploding curry that causes a body swap, but it never went too far. It reached that point of hilarity where I could be surprised and amused by something, but never did it feel like it was forced or tried too hard. These sequences of humour generally revolved around a little mascot character called Choo Choo and the student council president's sister Nanami. So when these characters were around, you knew something completely stupid could go down down, and something I loved about Nanami was that some of her comedy felt like really witty satire on that plotting villain sort of archetype that shows up so commonly. The only real issue I did have with the humour though was that usually when they did drop in a full episode of it, it'd appear at a really random time. There'd be a serious sequence or build-up around a certain jewel or piece of information over a couple of episodes, and then wham! Nanami slowly turning into a cow for 22 minutes. This inherently damaged the flow of the story for me, and as a result messed up the pacing quite a bit as well. There are also 3 of those recap episodes in there that did this, and I never liked those, even if they served well to sum up an arc before they moved on to the next one. The flow of the story was still excellent in spite of this though. It worked so well to move forward whilst operating in a way that didn't feel as though a huge amount was visibly changing. There were mysteries and the idea of villains operating in the background, but it was rarely ever shown explicitly until very late in the series. At times I certainly did lose track on what the significance of certain points was, but everything converged so seamlessly in the end that I was free to drop any doubts I had about the quality of the build-up. The class of the direction in order to make every one of these things work in the way it did was pretty spectacular to watch at times. This show was truly abstract, incredibly surreal and visibly symbolic in many places, and allowed you to delve into its world in a way not many pieces are really able to. Certain themes were utilised in a way that felt so interesting and unique through this abstract execution, with one of the main ones being the heavy implications of sexuality. It's by no means something in your face and tacky like you expect out of a good chunk of modern anime, and instead works on some of the more touchy subjects the concept of lust can bring up. Things like the importance or relevance of gender, incest and infidelity crop up here and there, and in ways that actually ended up entirely intertwined with the story and not at all out of place. Every single theme, ideal and point in this show was only made so meaningful through one of the most varied and interesting casts I've ever seen. A few characters give off vibes of others they were surely influenced by, and in a good way that is, as Utena reminding me of Oscar made me devoted to her from episode 1. But for the most part the characters were completely original and designed in a way that made me relate their role to them and them alone. The only characters I weren't particularly keen on were all the mostly nameless background and side characters who almost entirely acted like a rabble of morons. I'm sure that was intended though. They were pretty much there as a crowd to adore the beauty of those in the student council. So yeah, our core group starting up is made of the student council, Anthe, and Utena. I won't go into the student council individually, but as a group they were flat out brilliant, mysterious, admirable and stunning wherever necessary. Any one of them had enough development and idiosyncrasy to fill a complete story of their own. So the 2 I shall give a bit more thought into are the 2 main characters, starting with the Rose Bride herself, Anthe Himemiya. Anthe is a character in a role that didn't strike me as being that profound at first. She's this bride that gets assigned to the dueling champion and emotionally and loyally does as she's told. But beyond this, you see the difference between her and the Rose Bride, her as Utena's friend, and eventually her as something entirely different altogether. She changes so much, but not in a clear style of progression, and instead in an up and down, back and forth way, showing the confliction of her ideals within her role. She's someone who, because of this, heavily grew on me as the story progressed, once I realised there's more to her than meets the eye. Now it's finally time to talk about the revolutionary princess herself, Utena Tenjo. She's got the whole reverse gender role thing going on because of that fateful day in her past geared her life towards becoming a prince and not a princess. Being in this princely role, she's very strong and respectable, but of course she is far more masculine than your typical shoujo protagonist because of this. Honestly though, with how strong she was and how much she cared about her one goal in protecting Anthe, she didn't feel as though she was herself driving the story, and instead was being swept forward through the erratic actions of the rest of the cast. I don't at all mean that to be a negative point, as though it is more of a shonen cliche than in this genre. It was great to see a story driven by something more than bold and ballsy decisions made by one character. Also, just have a look at the design of this chick. It's incredible, honestly, and the first time she jumped onto the screen I was like, whoa, you're a pretty cool looking main character. I wish for a figment to be made of you. But the thing is, I pretty much feel the same way about all of the important characters. Check out Toga, and Juri, and Sayonji, and Nanami, and this guy, and that car. That entire car sequence is gorgeous though, so you should look forward to that. Yeah, all these characters and the entire show in general has so much style to it. It's got a really bright and intense aesthetic that dilates your pupils a fair amount just from looking at it. The quality of the animation was delicious, especially for 1997, and the visual end of the direction was frankly, and I use this term very loosely, a work of art. The way he constructed his scenes and used jump cuts, silhouettes and shadows was just glorious. There are a few shows up to the level of this thing's imagery, and the audio was alright. Nah, it's better than that, but I did have a couple more issues with it than with the visuals. It was mainly down to the fact that I was overly aware of certain pieces of music I wasn't a big fan of being used very often, and there's this one classical composition they chuck in all the time that sounded like a toned down version of a well-known piece and felt a bit dead to me. Other than this though, the music was varied and really quite interesting. Whether it was some tasty jazz or that crazy song that plays during the arena ascension scene that will now be in my head every time I'm in a lift until the day I die, it had so much flair and style to it that matched the feeling of the show. Now, I don't often delve into sound effects. Oh god, go sneeze. No, I'm alright. Now, I don't often delve into sound effects very deeply, but there's this sequence in every episode where a couple of shadows talk bollocks for a minute or so, and there's always such an interesting array of them in there. They're miming essentially, and then sound effects and weird voices are used, and for what is, as I said, shadows talking bollocks, there's something really interesting and amusing about these scenes because of this. And as this show wouldn't really work without it being done well in my opinion, considering the importance of the dialogue, the voiceover was absolutely top notch and something of a quality you don't hear very often, mainly because all these characters had so much range in their speech patterns. As I hope I've made clear, this is a series with a huge amount of variety in terms of themes and tone, so the ways each voice actor adapts their voice to the topic at hand was one of these. One of these. There we go then. I hope I was able to impart as much as I could about this thing without fumbling and rambling too much. It was a show that had me skeptical within the first 10 episodes, as I was fairly unsure where it was going, but once it got into it I was all over it. So I'm going with a tidily even 80% rating on Utena, and I'd say this falls into the category of one of those shows you really do need to watch at some point in your life if you're in love with this medium. This thing is licensed by Nozomi Entertainment in the US and by Kaze in various parts of Europe that don't speak English. So, have you seen this show? If so, what do you think of it? And as always, like and subscribe if that is perhaps something you could see yourself wanting to do. No idea what I'm reviewing over the next couple of weeks, so feel free to request something if you think I'd enjoy it, and with that, I will see you next week. Does this mean Shu was the dueling champion, and not the guy with the power of the king's right hand? I think someone's been travelling through time and ripping off Guilty Crown's ideas.